Welcome to Shadows of Reality, where we uncover the dark and twisted tales that have shaped history. In today's episode, we travel back to the late 17th century, to a small town in Massachusetts that became infamous for one of the most tragic episodes of mass hysteria in history, the Salem Witch Trials. What started as fear of the supernatural quickly spiraled into paranoia, accusations, and deadly consequences. Join us as we explore how a community fell apart in a frenzy of fear and superstition, leaving behind a chilling legacy that still haunts us today. In early 1692, the town of Salem was a typical Puritan settlement, strict, religious, and isolated. But under the surface, tensions were brewing. There were disputes over land, disagreements about religious practices, and a general fear of outsiders and the unknown. It didn't take much to ignite these simmering issues, and when a group of young girls began to exhibit strange, violent behavior, the spark that would ignite the Salem Witch Trials was lit. The first accusations came from two girls, Betty Paris and Abigail Williams, who claimed to be possessed by witches. Their fits, convulsions, and wild outbursts terrified the town. Soon, more girls joined in, claiming they had been bewitched. These claims sent shockwaves through Salem, and panic spread like wildfire. People began to whisper that the devil himself had come to town, working through these accused women. In the deeply religious community, this was more than enough to trigger full-blown hysteria. One by one, the accusations started piling up. Tituba, a slave in the Paris household, was one of the first to be accused. Under intense pressure, she confessed to practicing witchcraft, claiming that she had seen others working with the devil. This confession fueled the fire, and soon, accusations spread beyond the town. The frenzy of witch hunting had begun, with neighbors turning against neighbors and families accusing one another. But what drove these people to such extreme measures? The fear of witchcraft in colonial America was real, but it was also deeply tied to the rigid religious beliefs of the time. The Puritans believed that the devil was always at work, trying to corrupt their souls. They saw witchcraft as a tool of Satan, and anyone accused of practicing it was immediately viewed as a threat to the entire community. In this climate of fear and suspicion, logic and reason were thrown aside in favor of survival. As the accusations grew, so did the panic. Anyone could be a witch, and no one was safe from suspicion. Some of the accused were women who had long been considered different by the community, outcasts, widows, or those who didn't conform to social norms. But as the trials progressed, even respected members of the community were not immune. People were encouraged to accuse others, and those who did were often spared from suspicion themselves. In the courtroom, things took an even darker turn. Spectral evidence, claims of seeing spirits or having visions, was accepted as proof of guilt. This meant that anyone could be convicted based on nothing more than the word of a supposed victim. The accused were often left with no way to defend themselves against these invisible charges. Spectral evidence allowed fear to flourish unchecked, and it became a weapon used to destroy reputations and lives. The trials became a public spectacle. Neighbors gathered to watch the accused stand before judges, with accusations flying from all directions. Families were torn apart, and even those who had tried to maintain their innocence were often pressured into confessing. To refuse to confess was seen as a sign of guilt, and the punishments for those found guilty were severe. Hanging was the most common sentence, and those who were executed were not given a proper burial, their bodies often discarded without ceremony. But how did this hysteria spread so quickly? Historians argue that the economic and social tensions in Salem played a large role. With land disputes and a rigid hierarchy in place, there were underlying conflicts that made Salem a breeding ground for accusations. The strict Puritan belief system also emphasized conformity, which made anyone who stood out a likely target. The fear of the unknown, combined with these tensions, created a perfect storm for mass hysteria. Yet, as the trials went on, some began to question the legitimacy of the accusations. Reverend Increase Mather, a prominent figure in Massachusetts at the time, was one of the first to speak out against the trials, stating that it was better for 10 guilty people to escape than for one innocent person to be condemned. His words planted seeds of doubt in the minds of many, but the damage had already been done. Lives had been lost, and Salem had been forever changed by the madness that had consumed it. As time went on, the community of Salem struggled to come to terms with the horrors that had occurred. Regret, guilt, and sorrow filled the town as the true scale of the tragedy became apparent. It was only years later that the Massachusetts government officially declared the trials a mistake, and compensation was offered to the families of those who had been wrongfully convicted. But the scars left by the Salem Witch Trials remained, a haunting reminder of the dangers of mass hysteria and unchecked fear. As the trials escalated, so did the methods used to extract confessions. Accused witches were often subjected to intense interrogation, and while physical torture was not officially sanctioned, the psychological pressure was overwhelming. The accused were told that confessing was their only way to avoid execution, leading many to falsely admit to witchcraft in the hope of sparing their lives. Once they confessed, they were often asked to name other witches, further fueling the cycle of accusations. This tactic ensured that the web of suspicion grew larger with each new confession. Among the most infamous of the accused was Rebecca Nurse, a well-respected, elderly woman from a prominent family. Her arrest sent shockwaves through Salem, as many believed her to be incapable of practicing witchcraft. Yet, despite her standing in the community, she was convicted based on the testimony of those who claimed to have seen her spirit tormenting them. The case of Rebecca Nurse highlighted how no one, not even the most devout or upstanding members of society, was safe from suspicion once the hysteria took hold. The trials also had a profound impact on families, as many found themselves torn apart by accusations. Some parents accused their own children, and siblings turned on one another, all in an attempt to avoid suspicion themselves. In one particularly heartbreaking case, a man named Giles Corey was accused of witchcraft, but instead of confessing or denying the charges, he chose to remain silent. His silence was interpreted as guilt, and he was subjected to a brutal form of punishment known as pressing, in which heavy stones were placed on his chest until he either confessed or died. Giles Corey famously uttered his final words, "More weight." Despite the horror of these trials, some individuals did attempt to speak out against the madness. Reverend Samuel Willard, a respected Puritan minister, voiced his concerns about the legitimacy of the spectral evidence being used in court. He argued that such evidence was unreliable and dangerous, as it opened the door to false accusations and miscarriages of justice. However, his warnings went largely unheeded, and the trials continued unabated, claiming more and more lives. As the trials wore on, even the judicial system began to buckle under the weight of the hysteria. The sheer number of accusations made it difficult for the courts to keep up, and the use of spectral evidence became increasingly controversial. Some of the judges involved in the trials, such as Samuel Sewall, later expressed deep regret for their role in the proceedings. Sewall would go on to publicly apologize for his actions, acknowledging the grave mistakes that had been made. But by the time doubts about the validity of the trials began to spread, the damage had already been done. The witch trials had claimed the lives of 20 people, 19 by hanging and 1 by pressing, while countless others languished in jail, awaiting their fate. The town of Salem had been forever scarred by the events that had transpired, and the fear that had once gripped the community slowly began to give way to remorse and guilt. In the aftermath of the trials, efforts were made to restore the reputations of those who had been wrongfully accused and executed. The Massachusetts government issued formal apologies, and some of the families of the victims were granted compensation for their losses. But no amount of reparations could undo the damage that had been done. The Salem Witch Trials had left a lasting stain on the history of colonial America, serving as a grim reminder of the dangers of fear, superstition, and the breakdown of justice. The legacy of the Salem Witch Trials continues to resonate in modern times. Historians have long studied the events in Salem as a cautionary tale about the consequences of mass hysteria and the dangers of allowing fear to override reason. The trials have also inspired countless works of literature, film, and theater, including Arthur Miller's iconic play, The Crucible, which uses the Salem Witch Trials as an allegory for the McCarthy-era Red Scare. The story of Salem has become a powerful symbol of how fear can tear apart a community and destroy lives. The aftermath of the Salem Witch Trials left a community reeling from the horrors they had witnessed and the guilt of those who participated. The village that had once been united by religious devotion was now divided by fear and mistrust. Families that had accused one another struggled to reconcile, and the psychological scars of the trials lingered for generations. As the years passed, Salem became a symbol of how unchecked fear could destroy even the most tightly knit communities. One of the lasting impacts of the Salem Witch Trials was the profound effect it had on the judicial system in America. The trials exposed the dangers of allowing unsubstantiated evidence, such as spectral visions, to determine guilt. In the years following the trials, many judicial reforms were introduced to prevent such a miscarriage of justice from happening again. The use of spectral evidence was heavily criticized, and laws were changed to ensure that accusations would require more concrete proof in the future. This marked a significant step towards a more rational and evidence-based judicial process in the colonies. Another enduring consequence of the trials was the cultural shift in how witchcraft was perceived. In the decades after the hysteria in Salem, accusations of witchcraft began to decline across the American colonies. The shame and regret associated with the events in Salem caused many to reevaluate their beliefs about the supernatural. Witch hunts became less common as people began to understand the dangers of paranoia and fear-driven justice. The idea that a person could be condemned based solely on the testimony of others, without concrete evidence, became less acceptable. However, the Salem witch trials continued to fascinate and haunt the American imagination. Over the centuries, the trials have been revisited time and time again, with each generation interpreting the events through their own lens. For some, Salem became a cautionary tale about the dangers of religious extremism and the power of mass hysteria. For others, it symbolized the fragility of justice in the face of fear. Writers, historians, and artists have drawn on the story of Salem to explore broader themes of persecution, power, and morality. The trials have also left their mark on popular culture. The image of the witch as a symbol of rebellion, fear, and power is a direct descendant of the hysteria that gripped Salem. Films, television shows, and books often depict witches as misunderstood outcasts, reflecting the real-life persecution faced by those accused of witchcraft in the 17th century. This reinterpretation of witches has transformed them from objects of fear to symbols of strength and independence. Modern portrayals often flip the narrative, turning those who were once feared into powerful figures of resistance against oppression. One of the most famous reinterpretations of the Salem witch trials is Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible, written in 1953. Miller used the trials as an allegory for the McCarthy-era Red Scare, drawing parallels between the witch hunts of 1692 and the anti-communist hysteria of the 1950s. In both cases, innocent people were accused, tried, and condemned based on fear, suspicion, and unproven allegations. Miller's play highlights the timelessness of the Salem story, showing how fear and paranoia can warp justice and lead to the persecution of the innocent. The legacy of Salem is also evident in the physical landmarks that remain. Visitors to Salem today can explore the sites associated with the trials, including the Salem Witch Museum, which chronicles the events of 1692, and the Salem Witch Trials Memorial, a solemn reminder of the lives lost during the hysteria. These sites attract thousands of visitors each year, many of whom are drawn by the mystery and tragedy of what happened in this small New England town. The enduring fascination with Salem is a testament to the power of its story and the lessons it continues to teach. As we reflect on the events of the Salem witch trials, we are reminded of the fragility of reason in the face of fear. The trials serve as a stark warning about the dangers of allowing unchecked hysteria to take hold of a community. They show us how easily fear can be manipulated, how quickly justice can be distorted, and how deeply those wounds can cut. The lessons of Salem are as relevant today as they were over 300 years ago. When fear rules, reason disappears, and innocent lives are destroyed. The story of the Salem witch trials is not just a chapter in American history, it is a reflection of a universal truth about human nature. As long as fear and suspicion exist, the potential for injustice remains. Salem stands as a reminder that we must always question the forces that seek to divide us, and that justice must be grounded in truth, not in fear. Thanks for watching our channel. Keep exploring with us and discover something new in every video. See you on the next adventure.